History, as it is taught, is clean. It is organized into dates, names, and simplified stories meant to be remembered, tested, and repeated. It tells us who the heroes were, who the villains were, and how the world we live in came to be through a neat sequence of events. But beneath that polished surface lies another history, one that was never meant for classrooms, never meant for mass consumption, and never meant to be questioned too closely. This is the history that survives only in fragments, in forbidden texts, in whispered legends, and in patterns that seem coincidental until they no longer can be ignored. For centuries, scholars, theologians, and kings have agreed on one thing. Some ideas are simply too dangerous to allow, not because they are false, but because they challenge the foundations upon which power rests. When such ideas emerge, they're not debated openly. They are buried. Their authors disappear. Their symbols are reinterpreted. Their stories are rewritten until the original meaning is lost beneath layers of myth and ridicule. One of the most dangerous of these ideas centers on a single, haunting question. What if the most sacred object in Western history was never an object at all? The Holy Grail is commonly imagined as a cup, a vessel used at the Last Supper, later imbued with miraculous powers. In popular culture, it is something to be found, stolen, or guarded in some hidden vault. But this image may be a deliberate distraction. Ancient sources, suppressed gospels, and medieval secret traditions suggest something far more unsettling. What if the Grail was not a cup, but a lineage? What if it was blood, living, human blood, passed down through generations, protected in silence, and hidden in places no one would think to look? If such a bloodline existed, it would rewrite the story of Christianity itself. It would challenge the authority of churches, kings, and empires. And it would explain why entire groups, Templars, mystics, and royal dynasties, were hunted down and erased from history with such urgency. But perhaps the most unsettling implication is this. If the bloodline survived, it did not remain in Europe. As the medieval world collapsed into religious wars, inquisitions, and purges, secrecy became survival. Those who carried dangerous knowledge learned that the only way to protect it was to move it far beyond the reach of old powers. Beyond Rome, beyond Paris, beyond Jerusalem, beyond the maps of the known world. And this is where the story takes a turn that few historians are willing to follow. Across the Atlantic, in a land that Europe would later call the New World, a young indigenous woman entered recorded history under a name that would become famous across centuries. Her story, told to children as a simple tale of peace and curiosity, has been sanitized, romanticized, and reduced to folklore. Yet when examined closely, her life intersects with royalty, religion, and power in ways that defy coincidence. Pocahontas. To most, she is a symbol, a bridge between two worlds, a figure of innocence and tragedy. But symbols are often chosen carefully. And sometimes, symbols are not symbols at all, but disguises. Why was Pocahontas baptized and renamed with a deeply biblical identity? Why was she brought to England and presented to high society not as a curiosity, but with the respect accorded to nobility? Why were her descendants quietly absorbed into elite colonial families whose influence would shape the future of an emerging empire? These are not questions commonly asked, because they lead into uncomfortable territory. Territory where religion, monarchy, and colonial ambition intersect with ancient secrecy. Territory where the Grail ceases to be myth and becomes something living. History tells us that Europe discovered America, but secret histories suggest something else, that America was known long before Columbus, long before Jamestown, and long before it was ever meant to be settled openly. Some believe it was chosen. Others believe it was prepared. And a few believe it was the final refuge for something that could not be allowed to die. When the Knights Templar were destroyed, their fleets vanished. When heretical bloodlines were hunted, entire genealogies disappeared from record. And when Europe became too dangerous, the silence moved west. Official history dismisses these connections as fantasy. It insists that coincidences are just coincidences that symbols repeat by accident, and that power structures form randomly. But history, when observed carefully, has a pattern. It rewards those who control narrative, and it erases those who threaten it. The story you are about to hear is not a claim of certainty. It is an exploration of possibility. It is a journey through suppressed theology, hidden genealogy, colonial mystery, and the quiet spaces between accepted facts. It does not ask you to believe blindly. It asks you to notice. Notice how often bloodlines matter in systems that claim they do not. Notice how often powerful families emerge from obscurity fully formed. Notice how symbols of the sacred feminine, the rose, the vessel, and the womb appear in places they supposedly do not belong. And notice how one woman, taken from her homeland and rewritten by history, sits at the center of a story far larger than herself. If the Grail was blood, it would need guardians. If it was lineage, it would need protection. And if it was forbidden, it would need to hide where no one would think to look, behind fairy tales, beneath colonial narratives, and inside a story told so often that no one questions it anymore. This is not the history that was meant to survive. This is the history that survived anyway. And once you begin to see it, it becomes difficult to unsee. Because the most powerful secrets are not hidden in darkness. They're hidden in plain sight, wrapped in stories we think we already know. For nearly 1,000 years, the image of the Holy Grail has remained remarkably consistent in the collective imagination. A cup, a chalice, a sacred vessel glowing with divine power. It appears in medieval romances, church art, modern films, and popular fiction, always portrayed as an object to be found, guarded, or lost. Yet this image, so deeply ingrained, may itself be the greatest misdirection in Western history. Because when the earliest sources are examined carefully, the Grail begins to dissolve as an object and re-emerge as something far more controversial, something alive. The word Grail did not originally refer to a holy chalice. In early medieval texts, it appears as graal or gradle, a term used for a dish or vessel, often associated not with divinity, but with sustenance and lineage. Over time, theologians and storytellers refined the meaning, shaping it into something acceptable, something controllable. But hidden beneath this evolution lies an interpretation that the institutional church worked tirelessly to suppress, that the Grail was never meant to be held in human hands, because it flowed through human veins. This alternative understanding emerges not from fantasy, but from theology deemed too dangerous to survive intact. Early Christian sects, later labeled Gnostic, believed that divine knowledge, gnosis, came not through obedience to authority, but through direct spiritual insight. Many of these groups held beliefs radically different from what would become Orthodox Christianity. They believed Jesus was not merely a divine sacrifice, but a teacher of sacred wisdom. They believed the feminine was not sinful, but essential. And most dangerously, they believed that divinity could pass through blood. Within this framework, Mary Magdalene was not a fallen woman, as later tradition insisted, but a central figure, possibly the closest companion of Jesus, possibly his wife, and possibly the carrier of his lineage. Several apocryphal texts, excluded from the Bible during the formation of the canon, describe her as the one who truly understood his teachings. In some accounts, she is portrayed as the inheritor of secret knowledge, opposed by male disciples who could not accept her authority. If Jesus left behind not only teachings but descendants, the implications would have been catastrophic for emerging church power. A living bloodline would undermine the entire concept of apostolic succession, priestly authority, and divine exclusivity. Power would no longer flow downward from heaven through the church. It would flow horizontally through family lines, uncontrollable and impossible to monopolize. This is where the Grail transforms from cup to womb, from object to origin. The symbolism surrounding the Grail supports this interpretation more than it contradicts it. Medieval art repeatedly depicts the Grail as a vessel associated with nourishment, life, and continuity. The shape of the chalice itself mirrors the ancient symbol of the feminine, the womb. The Grail legends speak not of conquest, but of worthiness, purity, and lineage. Knights are tested not by strength alone, but by inner understanding. Many fail because they seek possession rather than comprehension. Even the term sangreal, often used in medieval texts, can be split in two ways: sangral, meaning Holy Grail, or sangreal, meaning royal blood. This linguistic ambiguity may not be accidental. In a world where ideas were dangerous, encoding meaning within language itself was a survival tactic. Truth could hide in plain sight, visible only to those trained to see it. The Church, recognizing the threat posed by these interpretations, moved decisively. Councils were convened, texts were selected, others were burned. The narrative of Christianity was standardized, and anything that hinted at a human Jesus, one who loved, married, or produced heirs, was condemned as heresy. Mary Magdalene was rebranded as a repentant prostitute, her authority neutralized, her legacy erased. Yet suppression is rarely total. Ideas have a way of resurfacing, especially when they're carried not on paper, but in people. By the time the Grail legends took literary form in the 12th century, Europe was already saturated with whispers of forbidden bloodlines. Royal families obsessed over genealogy, not merely for inheritance, but for legitimacy. Claims of divine descent were quietly treasured, even as the Church publicly denied such possibilities. The contradiction was never resolved, it was simply ignored. Secret societies emerged as guardians of these alternative truths. Some were philosophical, others militant. Among them, none would become more infamous than the Knights Templar. Officially, they were warrior monks tasked with protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land. Unofficially, they were rumored to have uncovered something beneath the ruins of Jerusalem, something that granted them sudden wealth, power, and influence. Whether relics, texts, or bloodline knowledge, the Templars were believed to possess secrets that placed them outside the control of both church and crown. Their rituals, symbols, and sudden rise unnerved Europe's rulers. When they were destroyed, the speed and brutality of the purge suggested desperation rather than justice. If the Grail was blood, then protecting it would require more than hiding an object. It would require safeguarding families, identities, and genealogies. It would require movement, secrecy, and the ability to disappear when necessary. This reframes the entire Grail myth. The endless quests, the guarded castles, the mysterious women, and the unworthy seekers, all of it becomes allegory. A coded story about lineage survival in a hostile world. A warning that the Grail cannot be seized, only inherited, and that those who misunderstand its nature will never find it. By the late medieval period, Europe had become increasingly dangerous for anyone associated with heretical bloodlines. The Inquisition expanded. Monarchs centralized power. Religious uniformity was enforced with violence. In such an environment, survival meant escape, not just from one kingdom, but from the entire structure of the old world. And so the idea emerges quietly and persistently that the Grail did not vanish. It migrated, not eastward, where old powers still ruled, but westward, across an ocean once believed impassable, to lands unclaimed by Rome, to territories where new identities could be forged, and old blood could flow unnoticed beneath new names. This is why the Grail, reimagined as blood, matters so deeply to the story that follows. Because once the Grail becomes human, history itself becomes a genealogy. Wars become purges. Marriages become strategies. Colonization becomes concealment. And figures once dismissed as peripheral, women, indigenous intermediaries, colonial brides, suddenly take center stage. Not as footnotes, but as vessels of continuity. To understand the forbidden Grail bloodline, one must let go of the chalice. One must accept that the most guarded treasure in history was not buried in stone, but carried across generations. Protected not by walls, but by silence. and hidden not in cathedrals, but in stories so familiar that their deeper meaning was never questioned. Because the greatest secret the Grail ever kept was this: it was never lost. It was alive. To understand why the idea of a Grail bloodline was so fiercely suppressed, one must first understand the nature of power in the ancient world. Power did not come only from armies or wealth. It came from legitimacy, from the belief that authority was sanctioned by the divine, unquestionable, absolute. Rome understood this better than any civilization before it. When the Roman Empire adopted Christianity, it did not merely embrace a religion. It reshaped it into an instrument of control. Early Christianity was not a single belief system. It was a fragmented, diverse movement made up of communities spread across the Mediterranean, each with its own interpretations of Jesus' life and teachings. Some saw him as fully divine. Others saw him as fully human. Many saw him as both. Some believed salvation came through faith alone, others through knowledge, and others through lineage and spiritual inheritance. For the first few centuries, no single version dominated. This diversity was a problem. An empire cannot tolerate theological ambiguity. Too many interpretations lead to too many centers of authority, and Rome required unity. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, he did so not out of spiritual awakening alone, but political calculation. A unified religion could stabilize a fractured empire if it could be controlled. Control required structure. Structure required doctrine, and doctrine required exclusion. Councils were convened, most famously the Council of Nicaea, where competing Christian ideas were debated, not to discover truth, but to decide which truths would be allowed to survive. Texts were voted in or out. Beliefs were labeled orthodox or heretical. And once those labels were applied, consequences followed. Ideas that emphasized direct access to the divine were dangerous. Ideas that elevated women were unacceptable. But above all, ideas that suggested divine authority could be inherited through blood were intolerable. Because blood cannot be regulated by councils. It cannot be taxed, ordained, or revoked. It cannot be centralized. A divine bloodline would create natural rivals to institutional authority. If Jesus had descendants, then holiness was no longer exclusive to priests and bishops. It could appear anywhere, in any family, at any time. Such a possibility threatened the very foundation of Rome's adopted religion. So the narrative changed. Jesus became celibate by assumption, divine by doctrine, and distant by design. Mary Magdalene was stripped of her status and recast as a sinner. The sacred feminine, once central in early Christian symbolism, was erased or demonized, and the idea of spiritual inheritance through family was replaced with obedience through hierarchy. But Rome's greatest fear was not simply belief, it was memory. Because even as texts were burned and doctrines enforced, people remembered. Families passed down stories. Symbols survived in art and architecture. Whispered traditions moved quietly through monasteries, courts, and secret fraternities. Rome could rewrite scripture, but it could not erase every trace of what came before. As centuries passed, the church grew stronger, wealthier, and more centralized. But it remained haunted by a paradox. Its authority depended on denying the humanity of Jesus, while its power depended on invoking his legacy. This tension created cracks, spaces where alternative interpretations could survive. Royal families, in particular, were obsessed with blood. Kings ruled by divine right, a concept that conveniently mirrored the very idea the church publicly rejected. Monarchs claimed descent from gods, heroes, and biblical figures, even as the church insisted that no divine bloodline could exist beyond Christ himself. This contradiction was never resolved because it could not be. It was quietly tolerated. Some dynasties went further. In the shadows of official history, rumors circulated of royal houses that guarded secret genealogies. Lineages said to trace back not just to ancient kings, but as sacred origins. These claims were never proclaimed openly. They were encoded in symbols, rituals, and selective marriages. Rome watched these developments with growing unease. The rise of the Merovingian kings in France exemplified this fear. They were said to possess sacred blood, marked by strange symbols and myths of supernatural origin. Their authority did not rest solely on coronation by the church, but on an aura of inherited sanctity. When they were eventually replaced by more compliant rulers, their bloodlines did not disappear. They were absorbed, hidden, or quietly extinguished. This pattern repeated itself across Europe. Whenever a family or movement hinted at authority independent of Rome, it faced elimination. The Cathars were wiped out. The Templars were destroyed. Gnostic texts were hunted relentlessly. Each time, the justification was heresy. Each time, the underlying threat was the same: uncontrollable legitimacy. The church could forgive almost anything except competition. And yet, no matter how aggressive the suppression became, the idea of a living grail refused to die. It adapted. It disguised itself. It transformed from theology into legend, from doctrine into myth. Stories replaced sermons. Romances replaced gospels. What could not be preached was sung. The Grail legends that emerged in medieval Europe were not harmless fairy tales. They were allegories, encoded narratives designed to preserve forbidden knowledge in symbolic form. Knights searching for the Grail were not seeking an object. They were seeking understanding. Worthiness replaced force. Lineage replaced conquest. Most importantly, the Grail could not be taken. It revealed itself only to those who already belonged to it. This was a subtle but powerful message. It suggested that divine inheritance was not granted by church authority, but by birth and spiritual alignment. A message Rome could never allow to surface openly. As persecution intensified, so did secrecy. Those who believed in the bloodline learned to hide not just ideas, but people. Names were changed. Identities merged. Records vanished. Survival required movement, and eventually disappearance. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had become a hostile environment for anyone carrying dangerous ancestry. Religious wars ravaged the continent. Inquisitors searched for invisible enemies. Kings consolidated power with brutal efficiency. The old world was closing in on itself. And yet, beyond its western edge lay something Rome could not control: an ocean. To Rome, the edge of the known world was chaos. Beyond it lay uncertainty, myth, and fear. But to those seeking escape from centralized authority, it represented possibility. A place where bloodlines could continue unnoticed, where old symbols could be reborn under new narratives, where history itself could be rewritten from the beginning. Rome's greatest fear was not that the Grail bloodline existed. It was that it might survive, because survival meant continuity, and continuity meant that one day, the authority Rome claimed exclusively could re-emerge from the margins, unchallenged, unannounced, and undeniable. If such a bloodline reached the New World, it would not arrive as conqueror or king. It would arrive quietly, through marriage, through assimilation, through stories so harmless they would never be questioned. And Rome would never see it coming, because the most dangerous bloodlines are not the ones that rule openly, but the ones that learn how to disappear. Long before the crowned heads of medieval Europe bowed to the authority of Rome, there existed a dynasty whose power seemed to come from somewhere older, deeper, and far less understood. The Merovingian kings of early France were unlike any rulers who came after them. Their authority did not rely solely on conquest or papal blessing. It rested on something far more unsettling to the church: an unspoken belief that their blood itself was sacred. The Merovingians emerged in the chaotic aftermath of the Roman Empire's collapse, a time when borders were fluid and power was still being negotiated. Official history describes them as a Frankish dynasty that ruled parts of modern-day France from the 5th to the 8th centuries. But even contemporary chroniclers struggled to explain their origins. Their rise was abrupt, their legitimacy unquestioned, their symbolism deeply strange. According to legend, the Merovingian bloodline began not with a human king, but with a mysterious event. One origin story tells of Queen Bina, wife of King Clodio, encountering a strange sea creature, often described as a quinator, a beast of 5 horns, after which she conceived a child. That child would become Merovech, the dynasty's namesake. To modern ears, this sounds like myth. But in ancient royal traditions, such myths were never meant to be taken literally. They were symbolic declarations of divine or non-human origin. In other words, the Merovingians were signaling something very specific. Their blood was different. Unlike later kings, Merovingian rulers were believed to possess sacred qualities by birth. Their long hair, which they were forbidden to cut, was not a fashion choice, but a symbol of spiritual power. Hair, in ancient belief systems, represented vitality, strength, and divine favor. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was to strip him of legitimacy itself. This belief was so deeply ingrained that when rival factions sought to depose a Merovingian ruler, they often shaved his head instead of killing him. This was not symbolic theater. It was theology. The church, still consolidating its authority during this period, tolerated the Merovingians at first because it had little choice, but never fully controlled them. Merovingian kings ruled with an autonomy that made Rome uneasy. Their power did not flow from papal approval. It flowed from ancestry, and that distinction mattered more than it seemed. As centuries passed, whispers followed the dynasty. Some claimed the Merovingians descended from ancient Trojan kings. Others suggested links to King David. Still others hinted at something even more dangerous, that they carried the bloodline of Jesus himself, preserved through Mary Magdalene and carried into Gaul after the crucifixion. These claims were never written plainly. They did not need to be. They survived through symbolism, through guarded genealogies, and through alliances that made little sense unless blood mattered more than politics. What troubled the church most was not whether these claims were true, but that people believed them to be possible. A dynasty whose legitimacy came from sacred blood rather than sacramental authority was an existential threat. It suggested that holiness could exist outside Rome's control. Over time, the church began to move against the Merovingians, not directly, but strategically. Rather than destroy the dynasty outright, it replaced them. Enter the Carolingians. In the 8th century, the Merovingians were gradually stripped of real power and reduced to ceremonial figures, later remembered as the do-nothing kings. In their place rose the Carolingian mayors of the palace, culminating in Pepin the Short and his son, Charlemagne. Unlike the Merovingians, the Carolingians owed their authority explicitly to papal blessing. Pepin's coronation marked a turning point. Kingship was now something the church could grant. The transition was framed as political reform. But beneath the surface, it was a theological coup. The Merovingians were not exterminated. They were absorbed, sidelined, or erased from public record. Their bloodlines did not vanish overnight. They were diluted through marriages, hidden under new names, or quietly removed from succession. This subtlety is important. Bloodlines believed to be sacred were not destroyed unless absolutely necessary. They were neutralized. Yet even as their political power faded, the myth of Merovingian sanctity persisted. Medieval secret traditions continued to reference a lost royal line, a lineage displaced but not extinguished. In Grail literature, the Fisher King, wounded, hidden, waiting, appears again and again. Scholars often interpret this figure allegorically, but the parallels are difficult to ignore. A sacred king, a wounded lineage, a kingdom rendered barren by its displacement. The Grail legends did not emerge in a vacuum. They appeared in regions once ruled by the Merovingians. They were written in courts connected to families that had benefited from Merovingian decline, and they carried themes that mirrored the dynasty's fate: loss, concealment, and eventual restoration. What makes the Merovingians especially important to the Grail bloodline theory is not just their mythology, but their obsession with genealogy. Unlike later dynasties that focused on territorial control, Merovingian legitimacy was deeply tied to lineage preservation. Marriages were strategic. Blood was carefully guarded. Outsiders were rarely fully integrated. This focus suggests awareness. not necessarily of a specific biblical descent, but of the importance of inherited sanctity. If the Grail was understood as blood rather than object, then dynasties like the Merovingians were not merely rulers, they were vessels. The Church could tolerate symbols, relics, and saints, but a living, breeding line of sacred authority was unacceptable. It could not be canonized, controlled, or confined. And so the Merovingians were quietly removed from history's center stage. But removal is not the same as elimination. As Europe entered the High Middle Ages, the memory of sacred kingship lingered in secret fraternities and coded traditions. The Knights Templar would later emerge in regions once influenced by Merovingian rule. So too would later noble families whose origins were suspiciously obscure, yet whose influence grew rapidly. Bloodlines do not vanish. They adapt. If the Merovingians carried a fragment of the Grail lineage, then their fall marks not an end, but a transition. A movement from visibility to secrecy, from throne to shadow, from Europe's center to its margins, and eventually from the old world to the new. Understanding the Merovingian kings forces a reconsideration of how power truly operates, not through open declarations, but through continuity, not through conquest, but through inheritance. The Church feared this kind of power because it could not be dismantled by decree. It could only be diluted, hidden, or displaced. The Merovingians represent a warning encoded in history, a reminder that long before crowns were blessed by Rome, there were rulers whose authority came from something deeper than law or doctrine, something carried quietly from generation to generation. If the Grail bloodline survived Europe's purges, it would not announce itself with banners or armies. It would do what the Merovingians ultimately did. It would disappear so that it could endure. When a Knights Templar first appeared in the early 12th century, they seemed almost insignificant. A small group of poor knights, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, offering protection to pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. They had no land, no wealth, and no visible power. Yet within a few decades, they would become one of the richest, most influential, and most feared organizations in medieval Europe. Such a transformation does not happen by accident, and it does not happen without a secret. The official story claims that the Templars were simply efficient administrators and skilled warriors who earned donations through loyalty and service. But this explanation collapses under scrutiny. Other monastic orders existed. Other knights fought in the Crusades. None experienced the meteoric rise of the Templars. Something set them apart from the beginning, something that drew extraordinary favor and extraordinary suspicion. That difference may lie in where they were stationed and what they were doing during their earliest years. The Knights Templar were granted headquarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, believed to be the site of Solomon's Temple. For nearly a decade after their founding, they conducted excavations beneath this sacred ground. Official records say little about what they found, if anything, but silence itself can be revealing. In a city where every relic, bone, and stone was fiercely contested, the absence of documentation suggests intentional secrecy. Jerusalem was not merely a holy city. It was a palimpsest of civilizations, religions, and buried histories layered atop one another. Beneath Solomon's temple lay archives, vaults, and traditions far older than Christianity itself. If anything of immense value, textual, symbolic, or genealogical, were to be found, this would have been the place. Soon after these excavations, the Templars changed. They began to receive astonishing financial support from across Europe. Kings entrusted them with treasuries. Nobles granted them land. The order developed an early form of international banking, issuing letters of credit and managing wealth across borders. Even monarchs became indebted to them. Such trust was unprecedented. It was as if Europe collectively decided that the Templars were indispensable. But indispensability breeds fear. The Church tolerated wealth when it could be controlled. It tolerated power when it was subordinate. What it could not tolerate was autonomy, especially autonomy grounded in knowledge the Church itself did not possess. Rumors began to circulate, whispers that the Templars had uncovered ancient secrets beneath Jerusalem, that they guarded relics not sanctioned by Rome, that their rituals contained elements older than Christianity. Some accusations were grotesque and absurd, clearly fabricated to justify later persecution. But others were more subtle. Claims that the Templars revered a mysterious head, that they practiced secret initiations, that they rejected the authority of the cross in favor of hidden symbols. These rumors, while distorted, point towards something real, an internal belief system that diverged from orthodoxy. If the Grail was blood, and if its lineage survived in secret, then the Templars make sudden sense, not as mere soldiers, but as guardians, not protectors of pilgrims, but protectors of people. Bloodlines require defense not only from violence, but from exposure. They must be hidden, relocated, and preserved through chaos. The Templars possessed the perfect structure for this role. They were mobile. They operated across borders. They answered only to the Pope, bypassing local authorities. They could move people, wealth, and information without interference. And they were bound by oaths of silence enforced by death. Their symbolism reinforces this interpretation. The red cross worn by the Templars was not simply a mark of Christian sacrifice. It echoed older symbols associated with blood and lineage. Their seal, depicting two knights on a single horse, is often explained as a symbol of poverty, but it may also represent duality. Two natures, two truths, one vessel. The visible mission and the hidden one. As the Templars' influence expanded, so did anxiety among Europe's rulers. Kings found themselves indebted to an order they could not command. The Church faced an organization whose loyalty was conditional, grounded in beliefs Rome did not fully understand. And rumors of heresy grew louder. By the early 14th century, the balance tipped. Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars and eager to consolidate power, moved against them. With the cooperation of Pope Clement V, the order was accused of heresy, blasphemy, and corruption. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, Templar leaders across France were arrested simultaneously. The speed and coordination of the arrests suggest premeditation. But what followed suggests panic. Interrogations were brutal. Confessions were extracted under torture. Charges were inconsistent and often contradictory. Yet the outcome was predetermined. The Templars were dismantled, their leaders executed, their properties seized. Officially, the order ceased to exist. Unofficially, too much was left unexplained. The Templars' vast fleet vanished. Their rumored treasures were never found. Many members escaped arrest entirely, disappearing into other regions under assumed identities. Some historians suggest they were absorbed into other military orders. Others believe they went underground, preserving their knowledge in secret fraternities that would later reemerge in different forms. If the Templars were guardians of a bloodline, then their destruction was not a failure. It was a transition. Bloodlines do not die with organizations. They adapt. They relocate. They hide in places no one expects. After the Templar Purge, Europe became increasingly hostile to unregulated power. The Inquisition expanded. Surveillance intensified. Survival required not resistance, but invisibility. This is where the Templar story begins to intersect with the wider world. Legends persist of Templars reaching Scotland, Portugal, and beyond. Some theories suggest they possessed knowledge of lands across the Atlantic long before official discovery. Medieval maps hint at coastlines unknown to Rome. Norse voyages were not isolated incidents. Knowledge of Western lands existed, fragmented, secret, and suppressed. If the Grail bloodline needed sanctuary, Europe was no longer safe. The New World offered something unprecedented: distance from Rome, distance from monarchs, and the possibility of reinvention. Identity could be reshaped. Genealogies could be rewritten. Sacred blood could flow unnoticed beneath new cultural narratives. The Templars' role, then, may not have been to rule or reveal, but to bridge, to carry something ancient across a historical threshold. Their wealth, logistics, and secrecy made them uniquely capable of such a task. Their destruction ensured that no centralized record of this transfer would survive. And perhaps that was the point. Because the most effective way to protect a dangerous truth is not to defend it openly, but to scatter it so widely that it can never be fully erased. The Knights Templar were not destroyed because they were corrupt. They were destroyed because they knew too much, controlled too much, and stood too far outside acceptable authority. If they guarded the Grail, it was not as a relic locked in stone, but as a living continuity carried forward through silence. Their disappearance marks a shift in the Grail story. From Europe's castles to unknown shores. From knights and kings to settlers, marriages and quiet assimilation. From legend to lineage. And in that silence, the Grail did not end. It waited. The destruction of the Knights Templar was not a moment of justice. It was an act of desperation. When power feels itself slipping beyond control, it does not negotiate. It eradicates. And in the early 14th century, that eradication came swiftly, violently, and with an urgency that betrayed fear rather than confidence. By the time the arrest began in 1307, Europe had already changed. Kings no longer tolerated independent powers. The church no longer accepted ambiguity. The age of quiet tolerance was over, replaced by an era of surveillance, orthodoxy, and force. In this environment, the Templars had become an anomaly. Too rich, too secretive, too untouchable. Philip IV of France was drowning in debt, much of it owed to the Templars themselves. But money alone does not explain the scale of the purge. If the goal had simply been financial relief, negotiation or partial seizure would have sufficed. Instead, the Templars were accused of crimes so grotesque that reconciliation became impossible. Heresy, idol worship, denial of Christ, ritual obscenity. These accusations were not designed to be proven. They were designed to shock. Under torture, confessions poured out, but they contradicted one another wildly. Some knights admitted to spitting on the cross. Others described secret initiations involving mysterious heads. Still others claimed ignorance of any wrongdoing at all. The inconsistencies did not matter. Once the charge of heresy was invoked, guilt was assumed. The process was irreversible. What is striking is not that the Templars were destroyed, but how little was recovered. The order's immense wealth, accumulated over nearly 2 centuries, vanished almost entirely. Treasuries were found empty. Castles held no hoards. Ships were gone from ports. Even the famed Templar archives, rumored to contain records of lineage, land, and knowledge, were never recovered. This absence speaks louder than any confession. If the Templars had truly been caught unaware, their resources would have been seized intact. Instead, it appears they anticipated the purge. They had time, enough time to move assets, relocate people, and erase trails. This suggests an organization not merely wealthy, but strategically prepared for annihilation. Prepared because annihilation had always been a possibility. The Templars were not naive. From their inception, they operated in dangerous proximity to power. They understood that knowledge without protection invites destruction. If they guarded something as volatile as a forbidden bloodline, contingency would not have been optional. It would have been central to their mission. Bloodlines cannot be locked in vaults. They breathe. They age. They reproduce. To protect them requires foresight across generations. It requires planning not for survival today, but for invisibility tomorrow. The purge achieved what Rome and the French crown desired on the surface: the elimination of a powerful, unregulated order. But beneath that surface, something else happened. The centralized guardianship of whatever the Templars protected was dissolved, and in its place emerged fragmentation. Fragmentation is not weakness. It is camouflage. Once scattered, the remnants of the Templars could no longer be targeted as a single entity. Knowledge became decentralized. Bloodlines dispersed. Symbols shifted form. What could once be attacked directly now existed only in traces. This is how dangerous ideas survive. In the years following the purge, reports surface of Templars appearing in unexpected places. Scotland, where the church's authority was weaker. Portugal, where the order was quietly rebranded rather than destroyed. Remote regions where records were sparse and enforcement lax. The Templars did not disappear. They dissolved into the landscape. More importantly, the idea of guardianship itself changed. No longer could an overt order protect a sacred lineage. The risk was too great. Instead, protection would come through assimilation, through marriage, through the careful blending of blood into populations where it could not be isolated or identified. Nobility married into merchant families into settlers, settlers into the fabric of emerging societies. This is how bloodlines vanish from history without ending. Fire was Rome's chosen tool of erasure. Templar leaders were burned publicly, their deaths meant to serve as warnings. Fire destroys records, intimidates witnesses, and leaves little behind. But fire cannot burn what it cannot see, and it cannot burn blood. The Grail, if understood as lineage, would have emerged from the Templar Purge not as a relic to be defended, but as a living inheritance to be hidden. Its survival would depend on obscurity rather than reverence, on silence rather than ceremony. This marks a turning point in the story. Before the Purge, the Grail was guarded openly, coded but centralized. After the Purge, it became nomadic. Its custodians were no longer knights in uniform, but families with no visible significance. Its symbols no longer carved into stone, but woven subtly into culture. And with this shift came a geographic question. Where does one hide something the most powerful institutions on Earth want destroyed? Not in Europe. Europe had become a web of oversight. Kingdoms communicated. Churches coordinated. Records were kept. Bloodlines were traced. Nobility was scrutinized. There was nowhere left to disappear, except beyond the known world. The timing is significant. Within a century of the Templar Purge, Europe would begin to look outward with renewed urgency. Maritime exploration accelerated. Rumors of Western lands circulated more intensely. Maps grew more detailed, even when official knowledge lagged behind. Some of this expansion was driven by trade and ambition, but some of it may have been driven by necessity. For those carrying dangerous ancestry, distance was the only true protection. The New World represented more than opportunity. It represented anonymity. In lands untouched by Rome's archives, new identities could be constructed without contradiction. Genealogies could begin again. Old blood could flow beneath new names, free from inquisitorial scrutiny. If the Grail bloodline survived, it would not arrive in the Americas heralded by banners or prophecy. It would arrive quietly, through individuals whose importance would only be recognized centuries later, if at all. This is why figures once considered marginal become central when viewed through this lens. Women, indigenous intermediaries, colonial marriages. These were not footnotes of history. They were the mechanisms through which continuity was achieved without detection. The Templar Purge did not end the Grail story. It forced it to evolve. By destroying the visible guardians, Rome ensured that whatever they feared would become invisible. And invisibility is the most effective form of survival. Once something is believed to be gone, attention shifts elsewhere. Surveillance relaxes. Memory fades. But blood remembers. The disappearance of the Templars marks the moment when the Grail ceased to be something that could be sought. From this point forward, it could only be recognized by those who knew what to look for and by those who already belonged to it. The fire that consumed the Templars was meant to cauterize history. Instead, it scattered embers across the world. And some of those embers, carried far from Europe's reach, would ignite new stories. Stories so familiar that no one would suspect they concealed one of the oldest secrets in human history. For medieval Europe, the edge of the world was not just a geographical boundary. It was a psychological one. Beyond the familiar coastlines lay uncertainty, myth, and danger. Sea monsters were drawn onto maps, not merely out of superstition, but as warnings. The unknown was feared, and fear was used to keep people close to the centers of control. But for those who needed to disappear, the unknown was not a threat. It was an invitation. After the destruction of the Knights Templar and the tightening grip of church authority across Europe, secrecy alone was no longer enough. Silence could be broken, records could be discovered, bloodlines could be traced. Inquisitors did not need proof, they needed suspicion. And suspicion had become lethal. Survival now required something radical. Distance. The idea that the New World served as a sanctuary did not emerge suddenly in 1492. Long before Columbus, whispers circulated of lands across the Western Ocean. Norse sagas described voyages to Vinland centuries earlier. Medieval maps, such as the Pyre Reis map, and others showed coastlines that should not have been known. These anomalies are often dismissed as coincidence or later embellishment. But taken together, they suggest something uncomfortable. Knowledge of Western lands existed, fragmented and guarded, long before official discovery. This knowledge would have been invaluable to those seeking escape. Secret societies, merchant networks, and monastic orders were far more connected than official history admits. Information traveled quietly through ports, caravans, and coded correspondence. If the Templars or their successors possessed navigational knowledge of lands beyond Rome's reach, it would explain both their confidence and their contingency planning. The New World was not just distant. It was undefined. There were no papal records there, no royal genealogies, no inquisitorial archives. Identity in such a place could be reshaped. A lineage hunted in Europe could become anonymous in the Americas. Blood that marked someone as dangerous in the Old World could mean nothing in a land without history books. This made the New World uniquely suited as a sanctuary, not for armies or treasures, but for people. Colonization is often portrayed as a spontaneous burst of ambition driven by gold, spices, and glory. But ambition alone does not explain the precision with which certain families rose to prominence in the colonies. Nor does it explain why some individuals were granted unusual protection, patronage, or status far beyond what their circumstances warranted. If sanctuary was the goal, then colonization offered the perfect cover. Settlements required settlers. Settlers required narratives. And narratives could be written by those in power. The story of discovery could eclipse the story of escape. What better way to hide than inside a movement celebrated by history? This reframes early exploration not as a single event, but as the culmination of quieter movements already underway. Fishermen, traders, monks, and exiles may have crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus, leaving no official trace because they did not want to be found. The ocean was not a barrier to those with knowledge. It was a filter. Only those prepared to abandon identity, language, and record would attempt such a journey. And only those with something to lose would take the risk. If the Grail bloodline required protection beyond Europe, the New World offered a solution that no fortress could provide. Fortresses attract attention. Sanctuaries dissolve into landscapes. What makes this theory compelling is not speculation alone, but pattern. Throughout history, when power becomes centralized, those who threaten it do not confront it directly. They migrate. Jews expelled from kingdoms carried knowledge eastward. Scholars fleeing persecution preserved texts in monasteries. Heretical ideas survived by changing geography. Bloodlines are no different. The idea that sacred lineage could cross an ocean may seem improbable, but history is filled with improbable survivals. Entire cultures have endured displacement by becoming invisible. Their stories persist not through monuments, but through continuity. The New World was not empty when Europeans arrived. It was inhabited by complex societies with their own spiritual systems, oral histories, and symbols. To someone seeking concealment, this offered another layer of protection. Integration into indigenous cultures would erase European identity entirely. Marriage, adoption, and alliance could absorb outsiders in ways Europe never would. This possibility is deeply unsettling to conventional history because it blurs lines between colonizer and refugee, conqueror and exile. It suggests that not everyone who came west did so to dominate. Some came to vanish, and vanishing does not mean disappearing without trace. It means leaving traces that no one knows how to read. Sacred symbols appear in unexpected places across the Americas, symbols resembling old-world iconography, yet integrated into indigenous contexts. These are often dismissed as coincidence or parallel development. But parallel development does not explain specificity, nor does it explain why certain symbols associated with lineage, fertility, and sacred blood appear repeatedly in colonial architecture, seals, and heraldry. If sanctuary was the objective, then concealment would require cooperation. No bloodline survives alone. It requires allies, protectors, and intermediaries. Indigenous leaders, translators, and women would have been essential to this process, not as passive participants, but as active bridges between worlds. This shifts the focus of history away from explorers and toward relationships. The survival of forbidden blood would not depend on ships or swords, but on trust, on alliances formed quietly, on marriages that seemed politically convenient but carried deeper significance, on children raised between cultures, belonging fully to neither, and therefore visible to no one. The New World allowed for this ambiguity. It allowed lineage to persist without proclamation. It allowed sacred blood to flow without being named. It allowed history to begin again without erasing the past, only hiding it. Maps from the late medieval period often show blank spaces labeled with warnings. But blank spaces are not empty. They are simply undocumented. For those fleeing documentation, this was ideal. By the time Europe formally turned its attention westward, whatever had already crossed the ocean would be indistinguishable from the fabric of the land. Names would be different, stories altered, origins obscured. The blood would remain, but the trail would be cold. This is why the New World must be understood not just as a place of discovery, but as a refuge. A final option when secrecy within Europe failed. A place where Rome's reach ended, not because Rome chose to stop, but because it could not follow. If the Grail bloodline survived, it did so not by resisting history, but by flowing with it, disappearing into the current of colonization, assimilation, and myth. And it is here, at the edge of the map, that the story begins to narrow. Because among all the possible sanctuaries, one region stands out. A land that would become central to England's ambitions. A place where indigenous diplomacy, European politics, and hidden lineage intersected in a way that history has never fully explained. Virginia. Before Jamestown. Before Pocahontas became a name taught to children. Before America had a story, the land was already being watched. Not as territory, but as a hiding place. Long before Jamestown was recorded as England's first permanent colony, the land that would become Virginia existed within a web of interest far older and more complex than official history suggests. To the modern mind, Jamestown appears as a bold experiment, an uncertain venture driven by trade, ambition, and imperial rivalry. Yet when examined closely, the colony's timing, location, and the individuals involved raise questions that simple economic explanations fail to answer. Virginia was not chosen at random. European powers did not stumble blindly onto this particular stretch of coastline. By the late 16th century, England possessed maps, reports, and navigational knowledge that suggested careful prior observation. Expeditions sent to Virginia were not acts of discovery so much as confirmations. The land was already known, its rivers charted, its resources estimated, its political landscape partially understood. This awareness hints at earlier contact. While mainstream history acknowledges failed colonies like Roanoke, it largely ignores the possibility of quieter, undocumented visits. Fishermen, traders, and private vessels may have reached these shores decades earlier, leaving behind no official trace because none was intended. In an age where secrecy equaled survival, absence from record was not evidence of absence. It was evidence of intent. Virginia's geography made it especially valuable. Its wide rivers allowed access deep inland while remaining defensible. Its climate was familiar to Europeans. Its indigenous societies were structured, diplomatic, and open to alliance under the right conditions. This was not merely fertile land. It was strategically invisible. More importantly, Virginia lay beyond the immediate reach of Rome. Unlike Spanish colonies further south, which were quickly absorbed into Catholic oversight, English colonial ambitions were shaped by Protestant resistance to papal authority. England itself had broken from Rome, creating a rare opportunity, a colonial project not directly monitored by the Church. For anyone carrying forbidden lineage or dangerous ancestry, English-controlled territory offered relative safety. Jamestown, then, was more than a settlement. It was a threshold. The Virginia Company, which funded the colony, was not simply a commercial enterprise. Its investors included nobles, courtiers, and individuals with deep ties to secret societies, esoteric philosophy, and alternative theology. Many were influenced by Rosicrucian ideas, the belief in a hidden spiritual mission guiding history beneath surface events. Some believed the New World was destined to become a new Atlantis, a rebirth of sacred knowledge free from old corruption. Others saw it as a place to reset civilization entirely. Either way, Virginia was imagined not just as land to be exploited, but as ground to be shaped. This ideological framing matters. Colonies driven purely by profit tend to collapse quickly when profit fails to materialize. Jamestown survived despite famine, disease, internal conflict, and staggering mortality. Its persistence suggests motives beyond economics. Someone wanted this colony to endure. The early settlers themselves were an unusual mix. Many lacked practical skills necessary for survival. Some were nobles unsuited for manual labor. Others were men whose backgrounds are curiously vague, with limited documentation prior to their arrival. This has often been interpreted as incompetence, but it may indicate something else. These individuals were chosen not for productivity, but for discretion. The colony's leadership structure also raises questions. Authority shifted frequently. Decisions were made that seemed irrational from a survival standpoint, but strategic from a relational one, particularly in dealings with indigenous leaders. Jamestown's survival depended not on strength, but on negotiation. And at the center of these negotiations stood the Powhatan Confederacy. The Powhatan were not a primitive society. They were politically sophisticated, with a network of tribes governed through alliance and tribute. They understood power, symbolism, and diplomacy. When English settlers arrived, the Powhatan did not respond with immediate violence. Instead, they observed. Observation implies choice. Chief Powhatan recognized that the newcomers could be either threat or tool. His response was cautious engagement, not annihilation. Food was exchanged, communication established, relationships formed. This restraint would prove critical, not just for the colony's survival, but for something deeper. Virginia was becoming a meeting point between worlds. Such meeting points are where history bends. It is here that the story begins to converge on individuals rather than institutions. Because bloodlines do not move as armies. They move as families, as marriages, as children born between cultures. And in this landscape of fragile alliances, one figure would emerge whose life defies simple explanation. But before that figure appears, it is important to understand the ideological climate shaping Virginia. Many early English thinkers believed history followed a divine pattern, that empires rose and fell according to hidden laws, that knowledge once lost could be restored in a new age. The New World was seen not merely as land, but as destiny, a place where sacred order could be rebuilt without Rome's shadow. This belief created a paradox. On the surface, England rejected Catholic authority. Beneath the surface, it remained obsessed with legitimacy, lineage, and divine sanction. Kings still claimed divine right. Nobles still guarded blood purity. Sacred ancestry still mattered. It was simply reframed. Virginia offered a way to reconcile this contradiction. In the colonies, old genealogies could be rewritten. New noble lines could be founded without scrutiny. Sacred blood could be absorbed into emerging elites without drawing attention. The lack of records was not a flaw. It was a feature. If a protected lineage needed to survive, Virginia was ideal. The Roanoke mystery adds another layer to this story. The disappearance of an entire colony without trace has long puzzled historians. While many explanations exist, assimilation, starvation, conflict, the possibility that Roanoke was absorbed rather than destroyed is often overlooked. Absorption would require cooperation with indigenous groups, shared survival, and secrecy. Absorption preserves blood while erasing record. The word carved into a tree, Croton, has been treated as a riddle, but it may have been a statement, a signal of transition rather than disappearance. If colonists integrated into indigenous society, their descendants would exist, but without English names, without English records, and without suspicion. This is precisely how a lineage vanishes while continuing. By the time Jamestown was established, the land had already demonstrated its capacity to erase origins. This made it invaluable not just to England, but to anyone seeking refuge from European oversight. The settlement that history remembers as fragile and chaotic may have served a quieter purpose, anchoring something that had already arrived. When Jamestown struggled, aid appeared. When it nearly failed, it was preserved. When conflict threatened, intermediaries emerged. The colony did not thrive by force. It endured by relationship. And relationships are the currency of bloodline survival. Virginia was not just being settled. It was being prepared. Prepared to absorb people whose importance would never be announced. Prepared to merge identities without record. Prepared to host a story that could not be told openly. By the time Jamestown entered history books, the land had already done its work. It had hidden what needed hiding. It had blurred what needed blurring. And it had created the conditions for a figure to emerge who would later be remembered as a symbol, but who may have been something far more deliberate. The stage was set, not for conquest, but for continuity. Few historical figures have been reshaped as thoroughly as Pocahontas. Her name is among the most recognizable in early American history, yet the version most people know is almost entirely fictional. Over centuries, her story has been softened, simplified, and repackaged into a comforting myth of harmony between worlds. But myths are rarely created to preserve truth. More often, they exist to conceal it. To understand Pocahontas, one must first strip away the layers of storytelling imposed upon her. Her real name was Matoka. Pocahontas was a nickname, likely meaning playful one or little mischief, used within her community. Even this detail matters because names carry power. The name history remembers was not the name she lived with. It was the name that made her approachable, harmless, and symbolic to English audiences. From the very beginning, her life was filtered through English eyes. According to the popular narrative, Pocahontas saved Captain John Smith from execution, placing her head upon his just as her father's warriors prepared to strike. This dramatic moment has been retold endlessly, presented as proof of her compassion and the possibility of peaceful coexistence. But modern historians increasingly question whether this event occurred at all, or whether Smith misunderstood or deliberately dramatized a ritual of adoption. In many indigenous cultures, ritualized execution ceremonies were symbolic, designed to incorporate outsiders into the tribe rather than kill them. If this was the case, Pocahontas was not acting independently or romantically. She was participating in a structured political and spiritual process, a process meant to transform Smith's status. This interpretation changes everything. It reframes Pocahontas not as a naive girl defying her people, but as a participant in diplomacy, someone positioned intentionally at the intersection of cultures. Even as a child, she was not peripheral. She was central. English accounts describe her frequent visits to Jamestown, where she brought food, relayed messages, and acted as an intermediary. This was not typical behavior for a chief's daughter unless there was a reason. Powhatan society was hierarchical and strategic. Access was controlled. Movement was purposeful. Pocahontas moved freely. This suggests she was trusted, trained, and assign a role. Yet English narratives consistently portray her as spontaneous, emotional, and childlike. This portrayal serves a function. It removes agency. It ensures that her actions are not read as deliberate, political, or strategic. A child does not threaten history. A diplomat does. As she grew older, her role evolved, but English storytelling froze her in time. The next major shift in her life came with her capture by the English. History presents this as a pragmatic act, a hostage taken to force negotiations. But hostages are typically treated as liabilities. Pocahontas was treated as an asset. She was not imprisoned harshly. She was educated, taught English, instructed in Christianity, introduced to English customs. This was not mere coercion. It was preparation. Her conversion and baptism marked a symbolic rebirth. She was renamed Rebecca, a biblical name associated with lineage, covenant, and chosen inheritance. In Scripture, Rebecca is the mother of nations, the woman through whom divine promise passes. Such a name is not chosen casually. Names tell stories before stories are told. The English presented her conversion as salvation, a heathen rescued from darkness. But this framing ignores a critical question. Why was she worth saving so carefully? Thousands of indigenous people encountered the English. Very few were baptized, renamed, and elevated with such attention. Rebecca Rolfe was not treated as a curiosity. She was treated as someone important. Her marriage to John Rolfe is often portrayed as a romantic union that brought peace. In reality, it was a political alliance of enormous consequence. Rolfe was not an ordinary settler. He was educated, well-connected, and deeply involved in the economic future of the colony. His marriage to Pocahontas stabilized relations with the Powhatan and secured English interests. But again, this explanation feels incomplete. Political marriages are usually arranged between equals. Pocahontas was not English nobility, yet her marriage was celebrated, promoted, and leveraged. She was presented not as a conquered subject, but as a lady of status. This distinction matters. After her marriage, she was taken to England. This journey was extraordinary. Indigenous individuals were not routinely transported across the Atlantic and introduced at court. Pocahontas was. She was dressed in English fashion, taught social etiquette, and presented to high society. She met King James I and Queen Anne. She was treated not as a servant, but as a representative. Representative of what? English propaganda framed her as proof of colonial success, a living symbol of civilization's triumph. But symbols are chosen because they resonate. And Pocahontas resonated in ways that went beyond novelty. There was something about her presence that mattered to those in power. Some observers noted her dignity, intelligence, and composure. Others remarked on the respect she commanded. She was not displayed as exotic entertainment. She was received. At the same time, her story was being rewritten. English writers emphasized her conversion, her loyalty to England, and her supposed rejection of her own people's ways. This narrative served colonial goals. It justified expansion. It soothed moral doubts. It created a story in which conquest was benevolent, but also erased something. It erased her autonomy, her cultural identity, and possibly her deeper significance. Shortly after preparing to return to Virginia, Pocahontas fell ill and died suddenly. She was approximately 21 years old. The cause of her death remains uncertain. Some suggest disease. Others suggest poisoning. What is certain is that her death occurred at a moment when her symbolic role had been fulfilled. She had been baptized, married, presented to the crown. Her child had been born, and then she was gone. History treats her death as tragic but incidental. Yet within alternative interpretations, it feels abrupt. A story that had been carefully managed suddenly ended. But bloodlines do not end with death. Pocahontas' son, Thomas Rolfe, survived. He was raised in England before eventually returning to Virginia. Through him, Pocahontas became the ancestor of numerous prominent American families. Families that would shape politics, land ownership, and social hierarchy for generations. This genealogical fact is often mentioned casually, without emphasis. But lineage matters in this story. It always has. The transformation of Pocahontas in a myth served multiple purposes. It made her safe. It made her story consumable. And it ensured that no one would look too closely at the spaces between events. Myths simplify because complexity invites questions. The Pocahontas taught in schools is gentle, apolitical, and self-sacrificing. She exists to make colonization feel humane. But the real Pocahontas lived at the intersection of power, diplomacy, and transformation. Her life was shaped by forces far larger than romance or coincidence. She was a bridge, and bridges are built intentionally. When viewed through the lens of bloodline preservation, Pocahontas' life takes on new coherence. Her movements, her treatment, her renaming, and her marriage align with patterns seen throughout history when continuity must be preserved without exposure. Her story was not erased. It was rewritten, not to destroy her significance, but to hide it. Because if Pocahontas was more than a symbol, if she was a vessel through which something ancient passed into a new world, then the myth that surrounds her is not accidental. It is camouflage, and camouflage works best when everyone believes it is decoration. The girl became a legend. The legend became a story. And the story ensured that no one would ever think to ask what truly mattered was not how Pocahontas lived, but what continued after her. When Pocahontas was baptized and renamed Rebecca, history presents it as a moment of spiritual transformation, a symbolic turning point where an indigenous woman supposedly embraced Christianity and English identity. But names are never neutral, especially in eras where identity was inseparable from lineage, inheritance, and divine order. The name Rebecca carries weight far heavier than most realize, and its selection may reveal far more than a simple religious conversion. In biblical tradition, Rebecca is not a passive figure. She is the wife of Isaac, the mother of Jacob and Esau, and a pivotal link in the lineage through which God's covenant is said to pass. She is a woman chosen not merely to believe, but to transmit promise through blood. She is associated with selection, inheritance, and continuity. In other words, she is a vessel of lineage. To give Pocahontas this name was not accidental. The English were deeply conscious of biblical symbolism. Names were chosen carefully, especially when they were meant to communicate legitimacy, destiny, or divine favor. By renaming Pocahontas as Rebecca, the English reframed her identity within a sacred genealogical narrative, one that emphasized descent, covenant, and inheritance rather than individual belief. This matters because baptism, in this context, was not only religious. It was legal and social. It altered her status. Rebecca Rolfe was no longer merely the daughter of an indigenous leader. She became a Christian woman recognized by English law, capable of marriage, inheritance, and lineage transmission within the colonial system. This transformation made one thing possible above all else. Her blood could now flow legally and invisibly into English society. Her marriage to John Rolfe has long been framed as a peaceful union that brought stability to the Virginia colony. And on the surface, it did exactly that. Hostilities eased. Trade improved. The colony survived. But marriages that change the course of empires are rarely motivated by affection alone. John Rolfe was not chosen randomly. Rolfe was educated, connected, and ambitious. He was deeply involved in the economic future of Virginia, particularly the cultivation of tobacco, which would soon become the colony's lifeblood. More importantly, he was a man trusted by the colonial leadership. His loyalty was unquestioned, his lineage acceptable. By marrying Pocahontas, Rolfe became the conduit through which her blood entered English genealogical records. This was not just a personal union. It was a controlled integration. If Pocahontas carried blood considered dangerous, sacred, or symbolically significant, then this marriage served as both protection and containment. Protection, because her lineage would be shielded by English law and status. Containment, because it would be embedded within a system that could manage its visibility. The bloodline hypothesis does not require Pocahontas to be a direct descendant of Jesus in any provable sense. What it requires is something more subtle, that she was perceived as valuable in a way that went beyond diplomacy or symbolism, that her lineage, real or believed, was worth preserving, redirecting, and embedding into the foundations of a new society. English elites were obsessed with blood. Despite Protestant rejection of Catholic authority, they never abandoned the belief that lineage conferred legitimacy. Noble families guarded genealogies obsessively. Royal blood was treated as sacred. The idea that certain bloodlines carried destiny was deeply ingrained. In this worldview, Pocahontas was not an outsider to be exploited. She was a resource to be integrated. Her presentation in England reinforces this interpretation. Rebecca Rolfe was not displayed as a curiosity in chains. She was dressed as a gentlewoman, introduced at court, treated with respect. This level of recognition was unprecedented for an indigenous woman. It suggests that her presence served a purpose beyond propaganda. She was living proof of something. English narratives emphasized her civilization, but beneath that narrative lay another message. This woman belonged. She fit. She could be absorbed. And through her, something new could be born that appeared entirely English while carrying something older within it. Her son, Thomas Rolfe, embodies this strategy perfectly. Thomas was born in Virginia, but raised in England. He was educated as an Englishman, removed from his mother's people, and prepared for a future that straddled two worlds. After Pocahontas' death, Thomas did not return immediately to Virginia. He remained under English guardianship, his identity carefully shaped. This delay is telling. If Thomas had been merely the child of a colonial marriage, there would have been little reason to manage his upbringing so carefully. But if he represented continuity, if his blood mattered, then oversight was essential. England did not simply protect him. It curated him. When Thomas eventually returned to Virginia as an adult, he inherited land and status. He married into prominent families. His descendants became pillars of colonial society, interwoven with the emerging American elite. Names associated with his lineage appear repeatedly in records of political power, military leadership, and land ownership. This is not coincidence. Colonial America did not offer equality. It replicated hierarchy. Families rose and fell. Yet descendants of Pocahontas consistently occupied positions of influence, often without clear explanation. Their prominence was accepted, normalized, and rarely questioned. This is how bloodlines hide in plain sight. The bloodline hypothesis gains strength not from a single piece of evidence, but from pattern. Repeated elevation, repeated protection, repeated integration into power structures. Pocahontas' story aligns with these patterns too precisely to dismiss as romantic accident. Her sudden death in England deepens the mystery. She died at the height of her symbolic value, just as her role as bridge and vessel had been fulfilled. No thorough investigation followed. Her burial was quiet. Her story was quickly redirected toward legacy rather than loss. History moved on. But again, bloodlines do not require survival of the individual, only continuity of descent. Rebecca Rolfe's significance may lie less in who she was allowed to become, and more in what she was allowed to pass on. If the Grail was blood, royal, sacred, or symbolically charged, then the safest place for her was not in Europe's decaying power structures, but in a new world where legitimacy could be reinvented. Pocahontas' marriage and motherhood provided a perfect mechanism for that transfer. Her story, sanitized and softened over time, ensured that no one would think to look for deeper meaning. Children learned her name. Adults learned a fairy tale. Scholars debated minor details. But the larger pattern remained untouched, because questioning Pocahontas too deeply requires questioning the foundations of American identity itself. It requires asking whether the New World was not only a land of opportunity, but a sanctuary. Whether colonial elites were not only opportunists, but custodians. And whether one indigenous woman's transformation into Rebecca Rolfe marked not assimilation, but transmission. Transmission of blood. Transmission of legitimacy. Transmission of something that could not be allowed to remain in the old world. Rebecca Rolfe disappears from history as an individual almost as quickly as she enters it. But her lineage does not. It expands, branches, and embeds itself into the emerging structure of America. Quietly, respectably, permanently. If the Grail bloodline survived, it did not do so by announcing itself. It did so by becoming ordinary. And in doing so, it ensured that the most dangerous question of all would never be asked. Not because the answer was hidden, but because no one would ever think to look for it. Once a bloodline has been successfully integrated into a new society, its survival no longer depends on secrecy alone. It depends on direction. Who marries whom? Which names rise? Which records are emphasized? And which quietly disappear? This is where genealogy becomes not a record of the past, but a tool for shaping the future. In colonial America, marriage was never merely personal. It was economic, political, and strategic. Land passed through families. Power consolidated through alliances. Reputation was inherited as surely as property. And while the colonies outwardly rejected European aristocracy, they recreated its logic almost immediately. Blood still mattered. The descendants of Pocahontas, through Thomas Rolfe, entered this system at precisely the right moment. They did not arrive as outsiders demanding recognition. They arrived already positioned, legitimized by English law, baptized into Christian identity, and connected to both indigenous authority and colonial leadership. This dual legitimacy made them uniquely adaptable. Thomas Rolfe's return to Virginia marked the beginning of a quiet but persistent pattern. He was granted land. He married well. His children and grandchildren did the same. Over time, the Rolfe lineage merged with families whose names would become foundational to American colonial power. What is striking is not simply that these marriages occurred, but how smoothly they occurred. In a society obsessed with status, outsiders were rarely welcomed into elite circles without resistance. Yet descendants of Pocahontas were not treated as social risks. They were treated as assets. Their ancestry was acknowledged, even celebrated, while its deeper implications were never explored. This selective acknowledgement is important. Genealogies connected to Pocahontas were often recorded carefully, but not interrogated. Her indigenous heritage was romanticized. Her English conversion emphasized. Her lineage framed as a symbol of harmony rather than a subject of inquiry. This framing neutralized curiosity while preserving prestige. Over generations, the bloodline dispersed into numerous prominent families. Some became plantation owners, others military officers, others politicians and judges. Their names appear repeatedly in colonial records, land grants, and leadership roles, especially in Virginia and neighboring colonies. This concentration of influence raises a question. Why did this lineage prosper so consistently? Colonial America was harsh. Many families rose and fell rapidly. Disease, debt, and conflict erased fortunes overnight. Yet Pocahontas descendants demonstrate unusual continuity. Their survival rate, socially and economically, was remarkably high. Continuity is rarely accidental. One explanation is simple privilege. Another is strategic alignment. But there is also a deeper possibility that this lineage was quietly favored, protected, and integrated because it carried symbolic or perceived legitimacy that others did not. In Europe, claims of sacred or royal blood were dangerous. In America, they could be repurposed. The colonies offered something unprecedented, a society without ancient genealogical scrutiny. Titles were unofficial. Nobility was informal. Authority emerged through influence rather than proclamation. This environment allowed old blood to assume new forms without challenge. Hidden genealogies thrive in such conditions. Family histories could be curated. Certain connections emphasized, others omitted. Records could be lost without suspicion. Over time, lineage became story, and story became identity. What mattered was not where blood came from, but how it functioned in the present. And yet, traces remain. Researchers who follow the genealogical trails often encounter anomalies. Missing records, sudden rises in status, strategic marriages that link Pocahontas descendants to families of disproportionate influence. These patterns do not prove intent on their own, but they echo patterns seen in Europe, where bloodlines were carefully managed under threat. The same logic applies here. Marriage into elite families ensured that whatever blood flowed from Pocahontas would not be isolated. Isolation invites scrutiny. Integration dissolves it. When a lineage becomes ubiquitous, it becomes invisible. This strategy mirrors ancient practices. Royal houses intermarried not only to consolidate power, but to diffuse dangerous claims. A bloodline spread widely cannot be easily targeted. It becomes part of everything, and therefore nothing in particular. Over time, descendants of Pocahontas became so numerous that her lineage lost any sense of exclusivity. This dilution was not failure. It was success. Sacred blood, if it existed, no longer marked individuals as special. It marked society itself. This is how a bloodline survives indefinitely. The idea that American elites might carry inherited legitimacy is deeply uncomfortable. It challenges narratives of meritocracy and rebellion against old-world hierarchy. But history does not reset simply because geography changes. Patterns migrate with people. The founders of America were not free of Europe's obsessions. They inherited them. Blood mattered in subtle ways. Family names opened doors. Connections mattered more than ideology. Power clustered in familiar lineages. And those lineages often traced back, not to the poorest settlers, but to individuals positioned early, carefully, and advantageously. Pocahontas' descendants were among them. Importantly, this does not require conspiracy in the modern sense. No secret council needed to convene. No written plan needed to survive. Bloodline preservation operates through habit, preference, and unconscious bias as much as design. People protect what feels legitimate. They elevate what feels familiar. If Pocahontas' lineage carried symbolic legitimacy, bridging old world and new, sacred and secular, then it would naturally attract protection without anyone needing to articulate why. This is the most effective kind of secrecy, the kind that does not require awareness. Over centuries, genealogies blur. Names change, branches spread, but certain lines retain influence disproportionate to chance. They appear again and again at pivotal moments, often in leadership, mediation, or symbolic roles. This pattern invites reflection rather than conclusion. Hidden genealogies do not announce themselves. They reveal themselves slowly through recurrence, through the quiet persistence of certain families, through the strange way some names endure while others vanish. By the time America emerged as a nation, Pocahontas was no longer a person. She was a story, a cultural icon. Her bloodline, meanwhile, had done its work. It had embedded itself into the fabric of society so thoroughly that questioning it would feel absurd. And that is precisely the point. A bloodline hidden too carefully invites suspicion. A bloodline hidden through overexposure disappears into normalcy. Pocahontas' descendants were not hidden in shadows. They were placed in sunlight until their uniqueness dissolved. This is how lineage outlives memory. Whether one accepts the Grail bloodline hypothesis or not, the genealogical patterns surrounding Pocahontas force a reconsideration of how history moves. Not only through wars and declarations, but through marriages, births, and quiet continuity. History remembers kings, but blood remembers everything. And sometimes, the most enduring legacies are not those carved into monuments, but those carried silently forward, generation after generation, until they become indistinguishable from the world they helped shape. When bloodlines are too dangerous to name, they leave traces in other ways, not through written confession or open declaration, but through symbols, quiet, repeatable, and easily dismissed by those who do not know how to read them. Symbols are history's most reliable survivors. They can be reinterpreted, aestheticized, or trivialized, yet still retain their original meaning for those initiated into their language. If the Grail bloodline survived into the New World, it would not announce itself genealogically. It would mark itself symbolically. Across colonial America, particularly in regions tied to early Virginia settlements and their descendant families, symbols appear that seem oddly out of place. They are often explained as decorative, religious, or coincidental. But when viewed together and in context, they form a pattern too consistent to ignore. One of the most persistent of these symbols is the rose. The rose appears frequently in European Grail lore as a symbol of secrecy, sacred femininity, and bloodline continuity. Sub rosa, under the rose, meant secrecy. The rose was associated with Mary Magdalene in suppressed Christian traditions, representing both hidden wisdom and lineage. In Templar and Rosicrucian symbolism, the rose signified knowledge preserved through silence. In colonial churches, seals, and family crests connected to early Virginian elites, the rose appears again and again, not as a central symbol, but as an accent, carved discreetly into wood, woven into stained glass, embossed on documents, always present, never explained. This is how symbols work when they are meant to endure. Another recurring motif is the chalice, not always depicted explicitly, but suggested through vessel imagery. Cups, bowls, womb-like shapes, and fountain imagery appear in architecture and art where they serve no obvious liturgical purpose. In Grail symbolism, the vessel is not about drinking. It is about holding life. Churches built in the colonies often incorporated unusual floor plans, orientations, and iconography that deviated subtly from European norms. Some were oriented toward the west rather than the east. Some emphasized Marian imagery more strongly than Protestant theology would normally allow. Others featured geometric patterns associated with sacred femininity and lineage rather than doctrine. These deviations were never dramatic enough to provoke scrutiny. They existed in the margins. Seals used by colonial governments and influential families offer another layer of silent communication. Seals are not casual designs. They are carefully chosen representations of authority, legitimacy, and continuity. Symbols placed on seals are meant to communicate meaning across time. Certain colonial seals feature elements that echo much older traditions. Intertwined branches, stars arranged in non-random patterns, phoenixes, and double-headed imagery suggesting dual authority or continuity beyond death. These symbols appear disconnected when viewed individually, but together, they mirror the symbolic language used by secret societies tasked with preserving dangerous knowledge. This includes groups influenced by Rosicrucian thought, which had quietly permeated English intellectual circles by the time of colonization. Rosicrucianism emphasized hidden wisdom, spiritual rebirth, and the idea that history unfolds according to a divine but concealed plan. It also stressed the preservation of sacred knowledge through symbolism rather than proclamation. America, to such thinkers, was not just a colony. It was a canvas. Even Freemasonry, which would later play a visible role in American founding culture, inherited much of this symbolic language. While Freemasonry itself emerged later, its roots draw from earlier traditions, Templar myths, sacred geometry, and lineage symbolism. The prevalence of Masonic imagery in early America is well documented. What is less discussed is why it resonated so strongly. Symbols of the square and compass, the all-seeing eye, pillars, and light emerging from darkness all echo older themes of hidden continuity and guarded truth. They do not prove a Grail bloodline, but they suggest an environment deeply comfortable with the idea of concealed inheritance. Symbols do not create belief. They preserve it. Perhaps most compelling are the silent markers, elements that seem meaningless until placed in context. Gravestones with unusual inscriptions. Churches built atop older sacred sites. Family Bibles with missing pages or added illustrations. Names repeated across generations with slight variations, maintaining sound while obscuring origin. These markers function like breadcrumbs. individually unremarkable, collectively suggestive. In Europe, symbols associated with forbidden bloodlines had to be hidden aggressively. In America, they could be displayed softly. The difference mattered. A symbol seen openly loses its threat. It becomes decoration. Its meaning dissolves into aesthetics. This may explain why so many Grail-associated symbols appear more frequently in the New World than in the Old. In Europe, they were hunted. In America, they were harmless. Harmless because no one believed they mattered anymore. This is the genius of concealment through normalization. Another subtle marker is the elevation of certain feminine figures within Protestant contexts that officially minimized such symbolism. While Protestant theology rejected Marian veneration, colonial art and literature often reintroduced feminine spiritual imagery under different names: liberty, Columbia, justice. These figures were not saints, but they carried the same symbolic weight. They represented the vessel of continuity. Columbia, in particular, became a personification of America itself, a feminine figure representing a new world, a new beginning, and a chosen destiny. This imagery did not arise spontaneously. It echoed older European traditions where land, lineage, and sacred destiny were feminized. If the Grail bloodline passed through women, as many suppressed traditions suggest, then the symbolic elevation of feminine vessels makes cultural sense. America was not portrayed as a king or warrior. It was portrayed as a woman. Even architecture participates in this symbolic language. Certain early American cities and capitals were designed with sacred geometry in mind. Alignments, proportions, and spatial relationships echo older traditions associated with continuity, harmony, and hidden order. Washington, D.C. is the most famous example, but it is not unique. Sacred geometry is not decorative. It is declarative when you know how to read it. None of these symbols demand belief. That is not their purpose. Their purpose is recognition. They exist for those who already suspect that history carries deeper layers than textbooks allow. Critics often argue that humans see patterns where none exist, and sometimes that is true. But patterns repeated across centuries, cultures, and power structures deserve attention, especially when those patterns align with documented behaviors of groups known to preserve knowledge through symbolism. The church used symbols to teach doctrine. Secret traditions used symbols to hide doctrine. The difference lies in who is meant to understand. What makes the American context unique is how openly these symbols could exist without challenge. The absence of centralized religious authority allowed for a kind of symbolic freedom unknown in Europe. Meaning could survive without explanation. And over time, explanation became unnecessary. Symbols fade when they're no longer needed. Or rather, they sink beneath awareness. A rose becomes a flower. A chalice becomes a cup. A feminine figure becomes allegory. Meaning dissolves into form. This is not loss. It is completion. If the Grail bloodline reached the New World and successfully integrated, its symbols would no longer need to warn, protect, or signal urgency. They could relax. They could decorate. Their work would be done. The greatest proof of successful concealment is not absence of evidence. It is abundance without interpretation. Today, people walk past churches, seals, and monuments without seeing anything but stone and paint. They admire design without asking why it feels familiar. They accept symbols without tracing their lineage. And that is exactly how it would have been designed. Not to convince the masses, but to whisper across time to those willing to listen. Because the most enduring messages are not written in words. They are carved into culture. And once carved deeply enough, they no longer need to be read. They simply are. Long before America existed as a nation, it existed as an idea. Not merely a landmass across the ocean, but a possibility, a blank space onto which old hopes, forbidden beliefs, and suppressed ambitions could be projected. For some, it was a commercial venture. For others, a religious refuge. But for a small, influential circle of thinkers in early modern Europe, it represented something far more ambitious. The chance to rebuild a sacred order that had been dismantled in the Old World. This idea was most clearly articulated in the early 17th century by Francis Bacon, one of the most influential philosophers and statesmen of his time. In his unfinished work New Atlantis, Bacon described a hidden society on a distant island, governed not by kings or priests, but by enlightened custodians of knowledge. This society preserved ancient wisdom, advanced science, and moral order quietly, patiently, without domination. On the surface, New Atlantis appears to be a utopian fantasy. But Bacon was not a fantasist. He was deeply involved in colonial planning, intellectual reform, and the reorganization of knowledge itself. His ideas influenced the Virginia Company, English colonial policy, and the philosophical foundations of what would later become modern science. The question, then, is not whether New Atlantis was fictional, but whether it was aspirational. Bacon and his contemporaries believed history moved in cycles. That ancient wisdom had once existed, been lost, and could be recovered. They believed certain truths were too powerful for their time and must be preserved quietly until society was ready. This belief mirrors older traditions, Gnostic, Hermetic, Rosicrucian, that emphasized hidden continuity over open proclamation. America, to these thinkers, was not a conquest. It was a restoration. The term Atlantis itself is revealing. Plato's Atlantis was a lost civilization, destroyed not by external enemies, but by internal corruption. The implication was clear: greatness collapses when power centralizes without wisdom. Europe, torn by religious war and authoritarian rule, fit this pattern perfectly. The New World offered a chance to begin again, not by rejecting the past entirely, but by carrying forward only what was deemed worthy. Knowledge, lineage, symbolic legitimacy. These could be transplanted into new soil, free from the institutions that had abused them. If the Grail was blood, and if that blood had survived persecution, then America could be imagined as its final kingdom. Not a monarchy, but a system. Not a throne, but a structure of influence embedded into society itself. This reframes the founding myths of America. Freedom of religion was not simply tolerance. It was decentralization of authority. Separation of church and state was not irreverence. It was protection. The rejection of hereditary titles did not eliminate bloodline influence. It obscured it. Power would still cluster, but without names that could be attacked. The founders of America were deeply aware of European history. Many were scholars of ancient republics, secret societies, and esoteric philosophy. They studied Rome not to imitate it, but to avoid its mistakes. They feared tyranny more than chaos. They believed that visible power invited corruption, so they made power invisible. America's system of governance dispersed authority across institutions, checks, and balances. No single figure could claim divine right. No bloodline could openly rule. And yet, continuity persisted. Influence passed quietly through families, networks, and shared ideology. This is not contradiction. It is evolution. If sacred lineage existed, America was the perfect environment for its survival. It did not need to rule openly. It only needed to endure. The idea of America as a chosen land appears repeatedly in early writings. Not chosen in a religiously dogmatic sense, but in a symbolic one. A land set apart for a purpose. A place where history's hidden current could flow uninterrupted. This sense of destiny was often personified in feminine imagery: Columbia, liberty, the virgin land. The land itself was treated as a vessel, a womb, a place of rebirth. These metaphors are not incidental. They echo the Grail's transformation from cup to bloodline, from object to origin. America was not the Grail. America was where the Grail could finally rest. Rest, not in the sense of dormancy, but in the sense of safety. The Grail no longer needed to flee, disguise itself, or fracture. It could diffuse. It could become part of the whole. This diffusion is what makes detection nearly impossible. In Europe, sacred blood stood out. It claimed legitimacy. It provoked reaction. In America, legitimacy was declared equal. Bloodline influence no longer needed to announce itself. It could operate through norms, expectations, and unspoken hierarchy. The absence of kings did not mean the absence of power. It meant power learned to wear anonymity. Even America's fascination with founding fathers reflects this shift. Authority was attributed to individuals, not lineages. Memory focused on ideology rather than ancestry. This focus redirected attention away from continuity of blood and toward continuity of ideas. Ideas are safer. They cannot be executed, but ideas often travel with blood. The vision of New Atlantis was not about creating paradise. It was about preserving continuity in a world that repeatedly tried to destroy it. It was about safeguarding something fragile through adaptation rather than confrontation. If the Grail bloodline existed, America represented its final test. Not survival through secrecy alone, but survival through integration. Through becoming so thoroughly embedded that removal would be impossible. This is why America feels paradoxical. It champions equality, yet produces dynasties. It rejects monarchy, yet reveres legacy. It denies sacred authority, yet surrounds itself with ritual and symbol. These contradictions are not failures. They are features of a system designed to carry something ancient into a new age without triggering the mechanisms that once destroyed it. New Atlantis was never meant to be a place you could point to on a map. It was meant to be a condition, a society where dangerous truths no longer needed protection because they no longer threatened visible power, where blood could flow freely because no one believed it mattered. And that belief, ironically, made it matter more than ever. Whether one accepts the Grail bloodline theory literally or symbolically, the pattern is unmistakable. America absorbed Europe's hidden currents and neutralized them by dispersion. What once provoked purges now provoked indifference. This is the ultimate sanctuary, not distance, but normalization. If the Grail was a lineage, then its final kingdom was not a castle or a cathedral. It was a system that ensured its irrelevance would be assumed, while its influence quietly endured. The New Atlantis did not crown a king. It crowned an idea, and ideas, once embedded deeply enough in a culture, no longer need guardians. They simply continue, unnoticed, unchallenged, alive. History does not only record events. It selects them, it frames them, and most importantly, it decides which questions are acceptable to ask. The most effective form of suppression is not censorship, but ridicule, because ridicule convinces people to police themselves. Once an idea is labeled absurd, dangerous, or unserious, it no longer needs to be destroyed. It simply withers from neglect. This is how alternative histories are neutralized. The concept of a Grail bloodline, for example, is rarely addressed directly by mainstream scholarship. It is not rigorously debated and disproven in public discourse. Instead, it is dismissed with a smile, grouped with fantasies, and excluded from serious conversation. This exclusion creates the illusion of resolution without ever engaging the evidence, patterns, or unanswered questions. But history is not neutral. It is written by institutions with vested interests, shaped by cultural priorities, and constrained by what is considered permissible to question. What survives in textbooks is not necessarily what happened. It is what fit within the acceptable boundaries of belief at the time those books were written. The Church understood this centuries ago. When early Christian texts were selected for inclusion in the biblical canon, the process was not simply spiritual discernment. It was political consolidation. Texts that emphasized hierarchy, obedience, and divine authority mediated by clergy were preserved. Texts that emphasized personal knowledge, feminine authority, or lineage-based legitimacy were excluded. Once excluded, they were labeled heretical. This pattern did not end with religion. It migrated into academia. Modern historical methodology prides itself on objectivity, yet operates within inherited assumptions. One of the most powerful assumptions is that symbolic, esoteric, or lineage-based interpretations are inherently suspect unless supported by explicit documentation. But this standard ignores a fundamental reality. dangerous ideas rarely leave explicit records. People do not document what can get them killed. When bloodlines were persecuted, records were destroyed deliberately. When secrecy was required, information was encoded symbolically. When survival depended on invisibility, documentation became liability. Expecting clean, linear evidence for such phenomena misunderstands the conditions under which they would have existed. And so, absence of proof becomes proof of absence, conveniently. Ridicule plays a crucial role here. By associating alternative interpretations with conspiracy thinking, academic and cultural gatekeepers discourage inquiry without engaging substance. The tone becomes dismissive rather than analytical. Questions are not answered, they are waved away. This is not accidental. Every society maintains taboos around certain ideas. In medieval Europe, questioning the church was taboo. In modern society, questioning foundational narratives, especially those tied to national identity, serves a similar function. The myth of America as a radical break from the old world is emotionally powerful. It reassures people that history resets, that inherited power dissolves at borders. The bloodline hypothesis challenges this comfort. It suggests continuity where rupture is celebrated. It implies that America did not escape history, but absorbed it, and that some of the same dynamics of power, legitimacy, and inheritance persisted beneath new language. Such implications are unsettling. So instead of confronting them, they are reframed as fringe. Suppression today rarely involves fire. It involves framing. An idea can be allowed to exist as long as it is presented as entertainment rather than inquiry. Novels, films, and speculative documentaries are safe spaces where dangerous questions can be asked because they're never taken seriously. This is why Grail bloodline themes appear frequently in fiction. Fiction acts as a pressure valve. It allows curiosity without consequence. The audience can explore forbidden ideas while reassuring themselves that it is just a story. The narrative remains contained. But containment does not mean irrelevance. The repetition of these themes across centuries suggests persistence. Ideas do not endure this long without reason. They resurface because they address unresolved tensions in collective memory. They provide coherence where official history leaves gaps. Suppression also works through specialization. Modern academia is fragmented into disciplines that rarely speak to one another. A historian may not engage with theology. A theologian may not engage with genealogy. A genealogist may not engage with symbolism. This compartmentalization prevents holistic inquiry. The Grail bloodline theory exists at the intersection of these fields. It requires synthesis rather than specialization. And synthesis is often discouraged because it threatens established expertise. When no single discipline owns a question, it becomes easier to dismiss it entirely. Another mechanism of suppression is scale. Individual anomalies are easy to ignore. A strange symbol here, a missing record there, an unusual marriage, a sudden rise in status. Each can be explained away in isolation. But when viewed collectively, patterns emerge, and patterns challenge narratives. Official history prefers isolated facts. Alternative history asks about connections. This is why mainstream narratives focus on events rather than processes. Events can be contained. Processes imply continuity, and continuity raises questions about who benefits over time. The bloodline hypothesis is not dangerous because it claims certainty. It is dangerous because it invites pattern recognition. It encourages people to look at history not as a sequence of accidents, but as a managed flow. And management implies managers. Another reason suppression is effective is because modern culture equates progress with disbelief. To be advanced is to reject anything that smells of myth, lineage, or sacred inheritance. These concepts are associated with superstition and tyranny. Yet paradoxically, modern systems still operate on inherited power. Wealth concentrates in families. Influence passes through networks. Political dynasties persist. The behavior remains. even if the language changes. Blood still matters. It just no longer announces itself. This contradiction is rarely examined because it destabilizes comforting narratives about equality and meritocracy. It suggests that invisible structures may shape outcomes more than ideals do. Suppression ensures these structures remain unnamed. When people do begin to question, they often encounter a familiar response. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This phrase is reasonable in principle, but often weaponized in practice. It shifts the burden of proof onto ideas that, by their nature, could not leave conventional evidence without being destroyed. The standard becomes unattainable. At the same time, official narratives are rarely held to the same standard. Assumptions about motive, intention, and coincidence are accepted without scrutiny. Power is treated as reactive rather than strategic. History becomes a series of accidents guided by vague forces. This selective skepticism maintains stability. It is also worth noting what is not suppressed. Discussions of secret societies are allowed, as long as they are framed as either harmless fraternities or exaggerated villains. Discussions of symbols are allowed, as long as they are treated aesthetically. Discussions of genealogy are allowed, as long as they remain personal or recreational. What is discouraged is synthesis. The moment these threads are woven together, the tone shifts. Curiosity becomes suspicion. Inquiry becomes paranoia. The social cost of questioning rises sharply, and most people choose comfort. The result is a kind of cultural amnesia, not because information is unavailable, but because attention is guided elsewhere. People are taught what to notice and what to ignore. Over time, this guidance becomes instinctive. The greatest success of suppression is when it no longer feels like suppression. If the Grail bloodline survived into the modern era, it did so not because it remained hidden forever, but because it became irrelevant to question. Once an idea no longer threatens power, power stops reacting to it. Indifference replaces fear. This is where we are now. The idea exists. It circulates. It entertains. It provokes mild fascination. But it no longer provokes action. And without action, there is no threat. Official history rests comfortably. Yet beneath that comfort lies a quiet truth. Suppression does not erase reality. It delays recognition. It shapes memory. It teaches people where not to look. But history has a habit of resurfacing, not because it demands belief, but because unresolved patterns demand interpretation. The story of the Grail bloodline persists not because it is proven, but because it is unfinished. It lingers in the margins, where uncomfortable questions live. It invites those willing to sit with ambiguity rather than dismiss it. Suppression ensured this story would never dominate history, but it also ensured it would never disappear. Because the most dangerous ideas are not the ones people fight over. They are the ones people stop questioning. And once questioning stops, history settles into a version of truth that feels complete, until, quietly, it no longer does.